He saw her name on a wanted notice the moment she stepped off the train. He stepped in front of it without a word. She was one of the wealthiest women in the territory. He was a ranch foreman who had not been paid in 7 weeks. He did not know who she was. He only knew that something was wrong and that he was standing close enough to do something about it. That night, she followed a stranger down a dark road to a broken-down ranch in the Nevada desert. She told herself it was the only sensible choice. She did not tell herself the truth. What happened next would cost them both more than either one expected. And what they built from that cost is the kind of thing that does not have a name, but that you will recognize the moment you see it. This story reminds us that real love does not begin with grand gestures. It begins with a single, quiet moment when someone chooses to see you clearly and does nothing with it except stay. This channel is for everyone who believes that the best stories have always come from the American West, where love is earned through hard work and honesty. If this story moved something in you, let it show. Leave a comment and subscribe.
The flame was small, cupped in her palm over the brass ashtray bolted to the armrest. Rain drove hard against the window glass, and the iron wheels underneath her made their steady grinding argument with the rails. And in the orange light of the car's single working lamp, Nora Calloway watched the San Francisco Chronicle curl and blacken and disappear. The paper had been an engagement announcement. Her name at the top, followed by his. Preston Hale, son of a business partner she had never liked, and a man she had met exactly 3 times. The engagement had been arranged while she was still in the first raw weeks of grief, while Garrett Voss sat behind her father's desk with her father's power of attorney, and smiled at her like he was doing her a favor. She had not agreed to it. No one had asked her to agree. She watched the last corner of the paper go dark, and pressed it flat against the brass until there was nothing left but a smear of ash. She was not afraid of Garrett Voss. She had told herself this on the platform in Sacramento, on the platform in Reno, and she told herself again now as the train rocked through the Nevada dark. She was afraid of something quieter and closer. She was afraid that Voss was right, that without the Calloway name to anchor her, she did not know who she was or what she was worth. Her outer appearance gave nothing away. Plain wool jacket over a plain cotton dress, both chosen because they fit and traveled well and cost nothing remarkable. Hair pinned without vanity. No jewelry except for the things she carried in the interior pocket she had sewn herself into the jacket lining. She had given the conductor the name Nora Cale without hesitation, and she looked like a schoolteacher taking a new post in a new town, which was precisely the impression she intended. Beneath the jacket, in that sewn pocket, was a silver watch. Her father's watch, engraved on the back with the words, "To Nora, the land knows your name, Father." She could have sold it. The watch alone would have kept her comfortable for 2 months in a modest hotel. She had not sold it. She was not yet ready to examine why. In the false bottom of her traveling bag was a leather document roll. Inside the roll, her father's true will, the original copy, the one Voss did not know she had found in the hidden drawer of the library desk the morning after the funeral, and 6 months of geological survey notes, compiled in her own handwriting, documenting evidence of illegal extraction at the Calloway mine near Elko. She had gone into that mine herself, alone on a 4-hour window, when the shift foreman was paid to look elsewhere. She had taken samples from the illegal drift tunnel and had them assayed by an independent laboratory in Oakland, and the results were folded into the document roll alongside everything else. Nora was not fleeing. She was hunting. But a plan that was nearly complete had developed a flaw she had only just understood. Sitting in a first-class car she could no longer afford to be seen in. And the flaw was this. She needed a witness. Someone whose name Voss could not buy or discredit. Someone outside San Francisco, outside the legal machinery Voss had spent 3 years constructing around the Calloway estate. Someone she had not yet found. The train lurched. then slowed, then stopped. Not her station. Not anywhere near her station. The conductor came through announcing a mechanical failure on the locomotive. Minimum 48 hours. The next stop was a town called Dustfall, Nevada, where passengers were welcome to disembark and find accommodations. Nora sat very still for a moment. Somewhere in the cars behind her was a man named Doyle, a hired tracker Voss had sent out of Sacramento 2 days ago. She had spotted him by his boots at the Sacramento depot, recognizable from a description her father's former housekeeper had passed along. Doyle had nearly found her at the Sacramento platform. He was close and getting closer, and she had a 48-hour window in a town she had never planned to visit. She picked up her bag and walked to the door. The depot at Dustfall was a single-room building with a pot-bellied stove, a row of wooden benches, and a bulletin board on the wall beside the door. Rain came in sideways under the platform overhang. Nora stepped off the train into the dark and the wet, and stopped walking when she saw the board. A wanted notice. Center position. Poor drawing. But the name printed beneath it in clear block letters was Nora Cale, wanted for cattle theft, Nevada territory. Her borrowed name, printed on a wanted notice in the first town she had stepped into. She stood there in the rain with the particular clarity that comes when two bad options arrive at the same moment. Her real name would bring Doyle to her door within hours. Her borrowed name could get her detained before morning. She had no good move. Only moves that were less bad than the others. She heard boots on the platform behind her and turned. The man coming toward her was carrying a 50-pound grain sack off the freight car, and he had no free hand and no reason to expect anyone in his path, and Nora had stopped walking to stare at the bulletin board, and none of that mattered in the moment they collided. They went down together. The sack split. Grain poured across the wet depot boards in all directions. The man got up first. He did not curse. He did not look at the spilled grain with anything she could read as anger. He looked at her for one full second, the way a person looks at something that requires an honest assessment, and said in a voice that was flat and unhurried, "You hurt?" Not, "Watch where you're going." Not, "That's 50 cents a feed on the ground." Just, "You hurt." It was the first time in 5 months that anyone had asked Nora that question without needing the answer to serve them in some way. "I don't think so," she said. He offered his hand. She took it and stood. He was tall, somewhere near 30, with dark hair and sun-worn skin, and the kind of jaw that suggested he had formed opinions early and rarely revised them. He wore a leather glove on his left hand, but not his right, and he had the eyes of someone who paid attention to things before deciding whether to comment on them. Those eyes went to the bulletin board. She saw the moment he registered it. She saw his gaze move from the board to her face and back, and she watched him make a calculation she could not hear. Deputy Frank Callum was walking the platform, making his evening round. She saw him coming from 20 yards. The man beside her stepped slightly left, putting his shoulder between her and the board. When Callum was close enough, the man said, easy and without performance, "Evening, Frank, this is my wife. Just came in on the train." Callum tipped his hat. "Evening, Ryder." He kept walking. Nora stared at the side of the man's face. He picked up what was left of the grain sack and said, still without looking at her, "Boarding house on 2nd Street takes women traveling alone. Clean enough." He started to walk away. "Why did you do that?" Nora asked. He stopped. There was a pause that felt like honest consideration. "Didn't like the way Callum was looking at the board. That was all." He walked away. Then he stopped once more from 20 feet and spoke back over his shoulder. "Broken Spur Ranch needs a cook and someone who can keep books, north of town. If the boarding house doesn't suit." He did not wait for an answer. Nora looked at the depot board, looked at the dark main street of a town she had never intended to visit, looked at the direction he had walked. She picked up her bag and followed. She told herself it was the only sensible option. She told herself she would leave when the train ran again. She did not tell herself the truth, which was that in the 2 seconds before he stepped between her and that board, she had been genuinely afraid, and that when he moved, the fear stopped. She would think about that later, or she would not think about it at all. Those were her 2 choices, and she had made worse ones. Broken Spur Ranch sat 5 miles north of Dustfall at the end of a road that the wagon made feel longer. The barn roof sagged on the east side. 3 sections of the north fence were down, and had been down long enough that the grass had grown up through the bottom rails. The kitchen window on the ground floor was covered with feed sacking nailed over a broken pane, and the whole property had the look of a place being held together by intention rather than resources. But there was lamplight in the windows. There was the smell of wood smoke and hay and animals in the dark. And somewhere in the barn, something shifted with the comfortable weight of livestock that had been fed and bedded properly. A ranch that has given up on itself does not smell like that. The man who had introduced her to Deputy Callum as his wife was named Ryder Cole. He had said almost nothing on the ride out, which she found she did not mind. He drove the wagon with the ease of someone who has done a thing 10,000 times and stopped thinking about it, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable so much as undecided. A woman opened the kitchen door before they reached the step. May Briggs was 58, and she had the face of someone who had been patient with a great many things and was prepared to be patient with one more. She was Calvin Briggs' daughter, she explained, come to manage the house while her father died. Her father was in the bedroom at the back of the house and had been bedridden for 3 months and was unlikely to last another 2. She looked at Nora the way a person looks at something they have seen before and are deciding how much patience to extend. "Can you milk a cow?" May asked. "No," Nora said. "Cook?" "Some." "How much is some?" "Enough that no one goes hungry." May looked at her for 3 full seconds. "All right." This was the first negotiation Nora had been part of in 6 months in which the other party wanted nothing from her name or her money. She noticed this. She did not say anything about it. In the morning, Ryder set out 3 terms before breakfast was finished. He was not unkind about it. He was a man who preferred things named plainly, and plain naming was its own form of respect. 1. She carried her share of the work, no exceptions, for being a woman. 2. She did not ask about him. He did not ask about her. 3. She left when the train ran again. Nora agreed to all 3. She had already broken the second one in her mind before he finished saying it. She had been reading him since the depot, the way she read a contract, looking for the language that would matter later, not to use against him, because this was the only way she knew how to trust anyone. You understood a person first, then you decided. He gave her the supply inventory as her first task. Count everything in the stores, record it, report back. A task designed to keep her occupied and out of the way. She returned the ledger in 2 hours with 3 columns he had not asked for. Daily consumption rate, projected shortfall by week, a prioritized purchase list organized by lowest cost per unit. He read it without speaking. He kept it. The real agreement between them was not the 3 terms spoken aloud at the breakfast table. The real agreement was this. She proved her value, and he asked no further questions. Neither of them named this. Both of them understood it completely. That first night in a small room under the eaves that smelled of pine boards and old wool, Nora lay in the dark and made an inventory of what she had. 1 false name, 1 real name she could not use, 1 document roll hidden in a bag under a cot in a stranger's ranch house, a pocket watch she had not sold. Outside the window, she could hear Ryder Cole making a final check of the horses before he turned in. Steady footsteps. The low sound of a man who spoke quietly to animals and meant it. The creak of the barn door. Then nothing. She thought, this is a man who has never abandoned a responsibility in his life. She thought, I have been abandoning mine for 6 weeks, and I am not sure anymore whether I'm running toward something or away from it. The horses settled. Dustfall went quiet. Somewhere east of her, Garrett Voss was sitting in her father's chair at her father's desk and making decisions about land that did not belong to him. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would begin. On the third day, a half-broken horse got loose in the corral while Nora was carrying water from the pump, and she made the mistake of trying to corner it herself. She had been watching Ryder work with horses all week, and had formed the impression that it was largely a matter of calm and positioning. What she had not accounted for was that a horse that does not know you yet does not find calm reassuring. It finds it suspicious. The young bay threw her before she had finished deciding what to do, and she hit the corral fence hard enough to see white for a moment. And when she could see clearly again, every hand on the property was looking at her. Old Walt, who was 68 and had been working cattle since before Ryder was born, did not laugh. But his mouth moved in a way that suggested he was exercising significant restraint. Ryder came over the fence in one motion, caught the horse in 30 seconds, and then crouched beside her in the dirt and said, "Next time, holler." Not, "I told you so," not, "Are you all right?" Just the instruction, delivered with the assumption that there would be a next time, and that she was capable of learning. She got up without help. Her hands were shaking, and she did not let them shake where anyone could see. That evening she asked him, with no apology in it, how to read a horse's weight before it moved. He told her in 4 sentences. She listened the way she listened to geological survey data, which was to say she was filing it and would use it. What she understood but could not have said out loud was this: he had not made her feel small. She did not know what to do with a man who did not make her feel small. Every man in San Francisco who had known she was Edgar Calloway's daughter had, in some form, made her feel that her value was a ceiling she could not exceed. Ryder Cole looked at her falling off a horse in front of his entire crew, and the only information he transmitted was, "You can do better. Try again." She thought about that longer than she meant to. Calvin Briggs died on a Wednesday, quietly, the way some men go. The funeral was small. The Methodist minister rode out from town, and May stood straight through all of it the way women stand straight through things they have been preparing themselves for. There were no flowers. The ground was too hard for flowers. That evening at supper, old Walt told a story about Calvin from 30 years back involving a mule, a poker debt, and what he described as the single worst fence repair in the history of Nevada Territory. It was not a particularly good story. The punchline landed a little sideways. But May laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and then Ryder laughed. One short sound, low and unguarded, there and then gone. Nora looked away from him immediately, but she was smiling, and she could not stop it. She would understand later that this was the moment. Not anything that came after. Just this, a bad joke at a dead man's supper table, and the sound of a man laughing when he did not mean to. 2 nights after the funeral, they were sitting on the back steps when the last chores were done. Neither of them had planned to be there. May had gone in. Old Walt had gone to the bunkhouse. The Nevada sky was doing what the Nevada sky does when the air is cold and clear, which is to put out more stars than anyone has a reasonable use for. Their shoulders were 4 inches apart, then 3. The gap closed the way gaps close when neither person is tracking it. At some point they were touching, shoulder to shoulder, and neither of them moved away. They did not speak. They did not make anything of it. They sat there until the cold became too insistent to ignore. And they went inside separately. That was all. That was everything. The next morning, she was looking at the ranch accounts, which she had been keeping clean since the first week, and she suggested selling the East Pasture's grazing rights for 1 season to a neighboring outfit. The numbers made sense. It would buy Broken Spur 3 months of breathing room. Ryder refused, not angrily, flatly. Land's not for leasing out. It is a temporary arrangement, Nora said. The math works. I know the math. Then you know it works. Land isn't math. He said it the way you say a thing that is finished, and he walked away, and that was the end of the conversation. She filed it. This was a man for whom land was not an asset. It was something else entirely, something she did not yet have the full story on. She would. That night she went to the Dustfall post office on a small errand and found a telegram waiting under the name May Briggs as she had arranged. 3 words in handwriting she did not recognize. He knows where. She folded the telegram and put it in her boot. Voss had her general location. She had perhaps a week before he narrowed it to this specific town. She walked back to Broken Spur in the dark, moving quickly, and did not allow herself to think about the feeling of Ryder's shoulder against hers until she was inside her room with the door latched. Even then, she only allowed it for a minute. She had work to do, and time was getting shorter. Preston Hale arrived in Dustfall on a Tuesday, which was an unremarkable day in a town built on unremarkable days, and this was part of why he was effective. He did not arrive looking like a threat. He arrived looking like a solution, which was considerably more dangerous. He was 31, well-dressed without drawing attention to it, and he had the particular patience of a man who has learned that waiting is more powerful than moving. He took a room at the boarding house. He asked careful questions at the general store, the post office, and May's eating house. He was looking, he said, for a young woman traveling alone. He described her with the warm concern of a family friend, which he was not. May heard 3 versions of this inquiry on the first afternoon. She said nothing to anyone. She watched. Nora was buying boot wax and accounting paper at the general store when she saw Preston through the front window. She recognized him a half-second before he saw her and used those 2 seconds to turn her back, pay quickly, and walk out the side door. She did not make it to the end of the block. Nora. His voice was not loud. It had never needed to be. She turned. She kept her face neutral. I don't think we've met. You look exactly like your father, Preston said. He knew it was the one thing she could not argue with. I am not here to cause trouble. Garrett is worried. Everyone is worried. You disappeared. I am traveling privately, Nora said. There are legal matters, things that need your signature. The mine near Elko, for instance. I know about the mine near Elko, she said, and she watched his face for the fraction of a second before he could manage it. There it was. He had not known she knew. He recovered smoothly. He mentioned, with the careful gentleness of someone delivering unfortunate news, that Garrett had obtained a legal instrument from a territorial judge in Carson City. A conservatorship order, he called it, issued in view of her extended absence and the unsettled state of the estate. He said it as though it were regrettable but necessary, as though she should appreciate the difficulty of the situation. She appreciated it precisely. It meant that the moment she surfaced publicly as Nora Calloway, she could be legally removed from control of her own estate before she had submitted a single piece of evidence to a single competent court. She thanked him for the information and walked away. Ryder had come into town for hinges and was crossing the street when he saw her from a distance. He saw the conversation without hearing it. He saw the man in the good coat and the way Nora was holding herself, which was the way a person holds themselves when they are contained by deliberate effort. He watched until the man walked away and Nora's shoulders dropped with the particular weight of someone recalculating their position under pressure. He fell into step beside her on the road out of town. They walked 2 miles without speaking. At the ranch gate, she said, "Thank you." "For what?" he said. "For not asking." He nodded and went to the barn. The town felt smaller after Preston arrived. The wind off the flats carried fine grit that reduced visibility and made the edges of things uncertain. Deputy Callum had also received a visitor, though his visitor came after dark and carried an envelope. Callum did not take the money immediately. He thought about it for 3 days. He was not a bad man. He was a man who decided that what was in the envelope was worth more than the thing it was asking him to set aside. This is worse than evil in its way, because it is so ordinary. 3 nights after the encounter with Preston, Ryder found Nora in the supply barn at midnight. The document roll was open on a grain crate, a geological survey map spread flat, and a lantern tilted close. She had been there for 2 hours. He stood in the doorway. He could have gone. He did not go. She looked up. She made a decision that he could see happening in real time. "Close the door," she said. He did. What followed was not a slow revelation. She told it in the efficient language of someone who has been carrying a thing alone and has decided the carrying is finished. Her father's mine near Elko was being over-extracted. Survey evidence showed tunneling into a secondary ore vein that was not part of any approved development plan. Someone was running a parallel extraction operation off the books, skimming yield before it reached the official ledger. Given the volume, it had been running for 2 to 3 years. Given the access required, it was an inside operation. Given who had access, Garrett Voss. "I went into the mine," she said, "before I left San Francisco. I took samples from the illegal drift tunnel and had them assayed independently. The results are in the document roll. The extraction marks do not match our licensed equipment. They match a rig that belongs to a company Voss owns outright." Ryder was quiet for a moment. "You went in alone," he said. "The shift foreman was paid to look the other way. I had a 4-hour window." "That is not a safe thing to do," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it is evidence." She saw the moment he stopped seeing her as someone in a difficult situation and started seeing her as someone who had been fighting a war he had not known was happening. The shift was visible in the way he was standing. His attention sharpened rather than softened. "What do you still need?" he asked. "A credible witness, someone who can testify to chain of custody on the samples and the survey work, someone who cannot be bought or discredited." The wind moved the barn door slightly in its frame. The lantern guttered once and settled. "I cannot be bought," Ryder said. Not as a vow. As a fact, the same way he might report that the north fence needed work. "I know," Nora said. And she did know. She had been reading him for 3 weeks. He moved to leave. At the door, he stopped. "I knew who you were," he said. "The night at the depot. The watch. I have seen that watch. Your father came through Dustfall 3 years ago. Stayed 2 nights. Decent man." Nora went still. "How long have you known?" "From the beginning." The lantern light held them both in a circle of orange warmth, and the barn smelled of hay and cold and horses, and neither of them moved. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. "Didn't seem like my information to use," he said. He went out. The door closed. She sat in the dark barn and thought about every man in San Francisco who had known her name and used it, as leverage, as currency, as a door they felt entitled to open. She had met exactly one man in her life who had known her secret and done nothing at all with it. She sat with that fact until the lantern burned out. The cold snap came in late October, which was earlier than it should have and colder than it had any right to be. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 4 hours and kept dropping. And a working ranch in that kind of cold is a race you cannot afford to lose. Stock had to come in. Water troughs had to be broken before they froze solid. The barn doors needed sealing against the wind that could kill a weakened animal in a single night. Old Walt's hip gave out at sundown. He walked himself to the bunkhouse without being told, which told Ryder how bad the pain actually was. May was inside sorting through Calvin's belongings, which was something she needed to do on her own. There was no one else available. Ryder and Nora worked from early afternoon until past 11 at night, with lanterns and breath clouds and the cold that makes your fingers stupid and your thinking clear and urgent. They did not talk much. The work did not leave room for talking, and by that point in their weeks together they had developed a kind of working fluency that did not require words. She knew when to hold a gate. He knew when she was about to lose her footing on the frozen ground and adjusted his position without making anything of it. When the last check was done and the last animal was secured, they sat down on the porch steps, because neither of them had the immediate energy to go further. The wind had dropped. The cold had settled into the particular stillness of a temperature that has finished falling and is simply present now, clear and final. Ryder went inside without speaking and came back with a blanket. his blanket from the bunkhouse smelling of wood smoke and leather and horses. He set it around her shoulders without asking and sat back down beside her. Not close, but close enough. They sat there until the cold became too insistent. She did not touch him. He did not touch her. But at some point her right hand, resting on the step between them, moved 2 inches in his direction without her having decided to move it. It stopped short of reaching him. He looked down at that small distance and was quiet for a long moment. He did not leave. This was their first intimacy, not a kiss, not a declaration. A hand that moved 2 inches, and a man who stayed. He spoke in the way that the cold and the exhaustion and that particular quality of silence sometimes pull words out of a person who would otherwise keep them. "My father had a ranch," he said, "east of here. Utah territory. A man named Aldridge took it with a contract my father couldn't read. I was 22. I tried to stop them taking the cattle out. Got my hand caught in a rope." He said it the way you say the weather, like a fact that simply exists. Nora did not say she was sorry. She said, "Did your father ever get it back?" "No." "Did anyone try to help him?" A pause. "One man hired a lawyer. Didn't win. But he tried." "Who?" Ryder shook his head slightly. "Not evasion. More like, that is the full extent of what I have of that story." He went inside. She sat alone with the cold and the dark and the weight of the watch in her pocket, and did not understand yet what he had just told her. She would understand it later. She would understand it in a barn, in the middle of the night, while old Walt said a name she had carried her whole life. She thought about a 22-year-old man standing between his father's cattle and the men who were taking them, with nothing but his body and his refusal. She thought about the scar under the glove on his left hand. She thought, "I have been surrounded my entire life by men who move toward money." She went inside. She did not sleep for a long time. The break did not come from Garrett Voss. It came from a Tuesday afternoon and a man named Frank Callum, who had thought about an envelope for 3 days and made the wrong choice. Deputy Callum rode out to Broken Spur with a warrant for the arrest of one Nora Cale, wanted for cattle theft, the warrant issued by the County Justice of the Peace in Dustfall on a sworn complaint filed by a stockman 2 counties over. The complaint was almost certainly fabricated. The warrant was technically valid. Preston Hale rode behind him. Not with him. Behind him at the distance of a man who has arranged something and wants to observe whether it works. Ryder came out of the barn when he heard the horses. He read the warrant, his jaw set. "There is an error in this filing," he said. "Give her time to." "Warrant's good," Callum said. He had the face of a man who has already lost the argument with himself and is not interested in having it again. Preston stepped forward. He was not cruel about it. He was reasonable, which was the most effective way to be cruel. He addressed Ryder with the patient tone of someone clarifying a simple misunderstanding. "The woman you know as Nora Cale is actually Miss Nora Calloway," Preston said. "Edgar Calloway's daughter. Heir to one of the largest private land holdings in Nevada and Utah territory. She has been here under a false name, using this ranch as a refuge while she evades a lawful conservatorship order issued by a territorial judge in Carson City." Ryder went still. The scene slowed. When emotion reaches its peak, time behaves differently. Every detail becomes precise and separate. He turned and looked at Nora. 10 feet between them. It felt like more. She did not deny it. She met his eyes directly. She said, quietly, just for him and not for the yard, "I was going to tell you." The words were true. They were also, in that particular moment, the worst possible thing she could have said. Because what Ryder heard, with the full accumulated weight of a man who had watched his father's ranch disappear into a rich man's paperwork and had been right about the world ever since, was not the truth of her intention. He heard the shape of every lie he had ever been patient enough to believe. His face went flat. Not angry, empty. Like a window with the curtain drawn. Callum moved toward Nora. Ryder did not stop him. The sound of the metal. Nora's hands coming together without resistance because she was not going to fight this here, not this way, not in front of this man. She looked straight ahead, chin level. She walked with Callum to his horse, and she did not look back at Ryder, and she did not ask him for anything. That was the wound, not the conservatorship, not the false name. That he stood still and let them put the cuffs on her while she was watching him, and that she walked away without asking him for anything at all. Preston lingered a moment, looked at Ryder with something that might have been genuine pity. She is a remarkable woman. I have always thought so. He rode after Callum. The ranch yard was quiet. Old Walt was standing at the corner of the barn. He had seen all of it. He did not speak yet. Nora was placed in the single cell at the back of Callum's office in Dustfall. A local lockup. 4 walls, a cot, a high window that showed a rectangle of darkening sky. It smelled of old wood and cold iron. She did not begin planning her legal strategy immediately. She had been doing that for 6 months, and tonight she was simply too tired. She sat on the cot in the dark. And in that dark, for the first time since the morning of her father's funeral, she let herself cry. Not for the arrest, not for the conservatorship, or the mine, or Garrett Voss. She cried because her father was dead, and she was genuinely alone. Alone in the particular way of people who have always been surrounded by people and seen by none of them. And she cried because for 3 weeks she had not been alone, not really. And she had not understood how much that had mattered to her until the moment she looked at Ryder's face and watched it go empty. She cried for as long as she needed to. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve. Then she began to plan. The pocket watch was in the box with her other effects. She had not been without it in 3 years. Its absence sat in her chest like a hollow place. In the barn at Broken Spur, Ryder did not eat dinner. Old Walt found him standing with the half-broken mare, the one no one else on the property would go near, running his bare right hand along her neck in the dark. Walt sat down on a hay bale. He had been on cattle drives and in mining camps and through 2 territorial land disputes, and he knew the difference between a man who needs to be talked to and a man who needs to be sat with first. He sat with Ryder for a while before he said anything. "You are not angry at her." Ryder said nothing. "I have watched you look at that woman for 3 weeks," Walt said. "I watched you look at that warrant. Those are not the same face. She lied. She did not tell you everything. There is a difference, and you know it. It comes to the same thing. Does it?" Walt was quiet a moment. "The man who hired a lawyer for your father. The one who tried. You remember his name?" "You know I do." "Edgar Calloway," Walt said. "I was riding for Calloway that season. He did not win, but he spent his own money on it. Because he said a man who has never read a contract should not lose his livelihood to one." Ryder's hand stopped moving on the mare's neck. "I kept that to myself," Walt said, standing. "Figured it was hers to say, not mine. But you are standing here being wrong about what kind of people these are, and I am too old to watch that without saying something." He went out. Ryder did not go to Dustfall that night, but before dawn he went to Walt and asked one question. "Where is her bag?" Walt brought him the document roll, which Nora had given him 3 days before, with quiet instructions to keep it safe if anything happened. Ryder sat in the barn and read every page of the geological survey by lantern light. He read his father's name in the margin of a will written by a man he had never thought about in connection with anything good. He read the assay results. He read the name of the judge who had notarized the forged document. He sat with it until the sky began to lighten. He understood by morning what she had been doing. She had not come to Dustfall to hide. She had come to build something solid enough to stand up in a court of law without her name attached to it, because her name could be legally stripped from her by a corrupt judge's signature. But evidence assembled by a credible independent witness could not. She had been fighting the exact same fight his father had lost. The difference was that she might win it. He put on his hat and rode into town. Nora had spent the night reading the arrest warrant line by line, and by morning she had found the flaw. The warrant was issued by the Dustfall County Justice of the Peace, but the original complaint had been filed in an adjacent county under that county's jurisdiction. The Dustfall Justice had no proper authority over a cross-county complaint without a transfer order attached. There was no transfer order. She asked to see the Justice of the Peace at 7 in the morning and presented this to him in precise and unhurried language. The justice was 70 years old and had held the position for 14 years and was deeply unwilling to be shown an error in his own court records. He studied the filing for 20 minutes. Then he released her on her own recognizance pending proper jurisdictional filing. She walked out of the county lockup at 9 in the morning into pale Nevada sunlight, and Ryder Cole was sitting on the bench across the street. He had been there since 7. They looked at each other across the street. She crossed to him. "You got yourself out," he said. "Yes. I came too." He stopped. "I did not know what I was going to do. I just came." "I know," she said. She was holding the document roll. She looked at it for a moment, then held it out to him. Not copies. The originals. The 6 months of evidence she had built piece by piece. The thing that stood between her and losing everything her father had spent his life building. "I need you to keep this," she said. "Not because I do not trust myself with it. Because if Voss's people come for me again, they will search me first. They will not look at a ranch foreman with no apparent connection to the Calloway matter." She was giving him the only thing that kept her safe. If Voss moved against her tonight without the document roll, she had nothing. She was not saying this to him with words. She was saying it with the thing she was putting in his hands. He took it. He did not say she did not have to. He did not say it was a lot to ask. He understood what it meant, and he took it. "There's a meeting this afternoon," she said. "At May's. I am going to offer Preston Hale a deal. I will drop investigation of the conservatorship filing in exchange for full documentation of Voss's extraction records. He will refuse, but his refusal, made in front of witnesses, is the next piece I need." "I will be there," Ryder said. "You do not have to. I will be there." This was not a rescue. It was a man choosing to stand in the same direction as someone he had decided to believe. At May's eating house that afternoon, Preston Hale was exactly what Nora had predicted: gracious, reasonable. He expressed genuine regret about the unpleasantness of the arrest. He declined her offer in careful language that left no record of what he was actually protecting, and he did it in front of May, who would remember every word, and in front of Ryder, who would also remember every word. Outside on the street afterward, Nora said, "He will wire Voss tonight. Voss will file the conservatorship with the territorial court within the week. We have 4 days. Then let us use them," Ryder said. What followed was 4 days of a different kind of work. Ryder rode to Carson City and spent 2 days in the territorial filing office locating records that showed Judge Hicks's financial relationship with the Calloway legal retainer. Public record, available to anyone willing to look. He brought back certified copies. Nora added them to the evidence chain. The case was nearly complete. May watched it from the edges, making coffee and feeding them when they forgot to eat. On the second day, when Ryder had stepped out, she said to Nora, "My late husband was a good man. I want you to know that is not common." Nora looked at her. "I know." "Do you?" May said. Not as a question. On the evening of the 4th day, with the document chain assembled and the case ready, Nora sat at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed and allowed herself to think about what came after the legal matter, if there was an after. What Ryder had looked like when Callum put the handcuffs on her. What she had looked like probably walking away without asking him for anything. She did not know what they were to each other now. She was not sure the question had an answer yet. She went to bed and slept, which was something she had not done properly in several days. Judge Hicks, presented with the documented evidence of his financial relationship with the Callaway legal retainer, declined to sign the conservatorship order. A territorial judge with his name on a record of improper payment has limited options, and Hicks chose the one that preserved the most of what remained of his career. Voss, understanding that the ground had shifted beneath him, instructed Preston to withdraw the conservatorship filing. Preston did so without significant argument, which told Nora he had never been deeply committed to Voss's methods. He had simply been unwilling to resist them, which was a different kind of problem, and not one she needed to solve today. Voss himself was referred to the Territorial District Attorney's office in Carson City. He would stand before the district court on charges of criminal fraud and theft of mineral assets. Under Nevada territorial law, conviction on those charges carried the possibility of a sentence at the state penitentiary. Voss did not go quietly. He hired 3 lawyers and filed 2 motions and wrote letters to people he believed owed him consideration. None of it changed the direction of what was coming. Deputy Frank Callum was removed from his position by the county sheriff, who was a practical man more interested in restoring the town's peace than in prosecuting a former deputy for following a warrant that had been improperly motivated. Callum left Dustfall. He did not receive a second chance. Some decisions write the end of a chapter, whether a person intends them to or not. 3 days after the legal matter resolved, when the noise had settled and the town had returned to its ordinary rhythms, Ryder found Nora at the western oak at the edge of the broken spur yard. He had the document roll with him. He set it on the ground in front of her. He put the silver pocket watch on top of it. He sat down against the tree with his back straight and his legs stretched out in front of him like a man who has decided this conversation will take exactly as long as it takes. Nora sat down across from him. She spoke first. "I kept the truth from you after the point when I knew you well enough to tell it," she said. "That is the specific thing I did wrong, not the false name at the depot. I did not know you then, and I was managing a real threat with the tools I had. But there were at least 2 weeks where I understood exactly who you were and what you had earned from me. And I chose not to tell you because I was afraid of what would happen when you knew. I did not trust you with it. And you had earned that trust. That is what I owe you an accounting for." Ryder was quiet. The light through the oak leaves was the late afternoon kind, amber and long-angled. When he spoke, it was the longest continuous speech he had made in her entire acquaintance with him. Every sentence came out more slowly than usual, like someone finding the words in a place they do not often go. "What hurt was not finding out you were wealthy," he said. "Was not even that you did not tell me. What hurt was standing in that yard and understanding in about 4 seconds that everything I thought I knew about what was happening was wrong, and that my first instinct was to be angry at you for making me look like a fool instead of angry at the men who were using you. I stood still and let Callum put cuffs on you because I was ashamed of myself, not because I thought for 1 second that you had done anything wrong. I knew you had not. I was embarrassed that I had not seen it coming, and I took that out on you in the worst possible way. That is what I cannot make right." Nora looked at him for a moment. "You were at the lockup by 7 in the morning, she said. "That is not. It is not nothing, Ryder." He was quiet. "I will not keep things from you to manage how you see me," she said. "If something concerns both of us, it concerns both of us. I am done working alone when I do not have to be." "I will ask," he said, "instead of assuming. When something looks like what I have seen before, I will ask you first, before I decide what it is." Neither of them said, "And now everything is fine." Neither of them pretended the conversation had erased the weight of what had happened. They had looked directly at the fault lines between them and said, "I see those. I'm standing here anyway." The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before. The previous silences between them had been full of things unsaid. This one was simply quiet. 2 people resting after something hard. Ryder picked up the pocket watch. He turned it over and read the back. He set it in her open palm. "Your father's," he said. "Keep it," she said. I would like you to have it." He looked at her. "There is no trick to it," she said. "I just want someone I trust to have it." He closed his hand around it and put it in his breast pocket. Then he reached up and pulled off the left-hand glove. He held his scarred hand out in front of him in the afternoon light, palm up, open. No explanation, no speech, just the scar, visible for the first time without cover, and the hand extended toward her. She took it. At the edge of May's property, visible from the western oak if you knew where to look, a rider sat on a gray horse at the fence line. He was about 30 years old and had the look of a man who has traveled a long way for a short look at something. When Nora and Ryder walked back toward the ranch together, the rider watched them for a moment. Then he turned the gray horse and rode north and did not come back. Old Walt, who had been mending that section of fence since morning and had therefore seen the rider arrive and depart, straightened up and watched him go. He did not say anything to anyone. The rider was Thomas Aldridge, son of the man who had taken the coal ranch when Ryder was 22. He had heard, through the networks that carry information across territory lines, that Ryder Coal had been central to a major fraud prosecution in Dustfall. He had come to see if the foreman's kid had grown into a man who had figured out how to fight back the right way. He had gotten his answer. He rode north and the past rode with him, and neither of them came back. The wedding was on a Saturday in late October when the cottonwood along the creek had gone fully yellow, and the air carried the clean, cold smell of a Nevada autumn settling in for the season. May strung lanterns between the fence posts. Practical ones meant to last through the wind, not the decorative kind. The whole of Dustfall came, which was not remarkable because Dustfall was small enough that the whole of it could fit in May's yard with room left over. People brought food. Someone brought a fiddle. The Methodist minister who had ridden out for Calvin Briggs' funeral rode out again, and this time he had more to work with. Nora wore a dress that May and 2 other women from town had made in 4 days. The seam at the left sleeve was slightly crooked. She had been offered a chance to have it corrected and said no. She wore it as it came, made with care rather than perfection, by people who had wanted to make it. Ryder stood at the western oak. Old Walt and 2 of the ranch hands had dug it up and moved it to the yard over the previous week in secret, working in the early mornings before anyone who might mention it to Nora was awake. When she came around the corner of the house and saw it standing there in the center of the yard, she stopped walking for 3 full seconds. Then she continued. He was wearing his good clothes. He was not nervous. He had the expression of a man who has made a decision he has no doubts about, which is the rarest expression in the world and the most beautiful one. He spoke 4 sentences. The reader who has been with them since the depot in the rain knows what 4 sentences from Ryder Coal costs and what they are worth. They are the 4 most complete sentences he has ever assembled. What they contained was not recorded in full. Some things belong to the people who said them. Nora spoke longer. She always had. What she said is also not recorded in full. Same reason. Old Walt placed the pocket watch in Ryder's hand during the ceremony. Nora had given it to him the previous morning with instructions. When Walt set it in his palm, Ryder looked at it and then looked at Nora, and understood that this was not a gift passing in one direction. It was a thing that now belonged to both of them equally, the way the land and the work and the years ahead belonged to both of them equally. At the far end of the row of chairs, slightly apart from the others, there was one chair with a bunch of dried sage on it. May had placed it there before the guests arrived. No one asked why. Her son's name had been Daniel. He would have been 31 that year. The chair was not explained in any speech or toast. It simply existed, the way grief exists inside happiness, not erasing it but giving it its true weight. May smiled through all of it. At one point she looked at the chair with an expression she made no effort to hide. Nobody looked away from her. Nobody pretended not to see. This was what it actually meant to be a community. After the ceremony, May made the only toast. May said, "I watched these 2 people come at each other sideways for 2 months because they were both too careful to walk straight at something they wanted. Then they stopped being careful and started being honest, which is the harder thing. I have lived in Dustfall 30 years, and I have seen a good many people get married. I have not seen many of them choose each other the way these two did. She raised her glass. To Ryder and Nora. Everyone raised their glasses. The fiddle started, and the lanterns held against the October wind, and the cottonwood scattered yellow leaves across May's yard. And in the middle of all of it, Ryder Cole and Nora Calloway stood together under the oak. They had moved from the edge of a field into the center of a celebration. And the thing they had built between them, piece by patient piece, was as solid as anything either of them had ever stood on. 2.5 years later, Broken Spur Ranch was solvent. Not prosperous, not yet, perhaps not ever in the way that means ease without effort. But the books were balanced, and the fences were up, and the barn roof had been repaired on the east side, and the kitchen window had real glass in it again. Ryder had bought the ranch from Calvin Briggs's estate at fair market price, spread over 8 months, with the income from 2 good cattle seasons. Nora had offered once to accelerate the purchase. He had said no. She had not offered again. This was how they had decided to do things, and the decision had been made once and was not revisited. The Calloway holdings were under Nora's management, conducted from a desk in the back room of the ranch house where the window looked out over the corral. Attorneys and accountants traveled to Dustfall. She did not travel to them. The mines near Elko were under honest management for the first time in 4 years. The rail lines were running clean ledgers. The land was still the land. Garrett Voss had stood before the district court in Carson City and been convicted on 2 counts of criminal fraud and 1 count of theft of mineral assets. He was serving his sentence at the state penitentiary. He had appealed once. The appeal had been denied. Preston Hale had cooperated with the territorial district attorney and received a reduced judgment, a fine rather than imprisonment, and had returned to San Francisco where he ran a small law practice that by all accounts conducted itself honestly. People sometimes surprise you in that direction. A legal aid fund operated quietly out of a post office box in Dustfall under the name the Calloway Fund, though Nora used that name only on official filings. It provided free legal representation to families facing fraudulent land contracts in Nevada and Utah territory. It was not large. It was specific. It worked on the exact problem that had taken the Cole Ranch from a man who had never learned to read a contract, and the several ranches taken the same way before and after, by men who understood that an honest person without legal representation is no match for a dishonest one with it. Ryder had not named the fund. He had described one evening at the kitchen table what it needed to do. He had explained it clearly and specifically in the way he explained any practical problem. Nora had built it from what he said and put his father's name in the dedication. He had read that and not spoken for a while. Then he had said, "Thank you." That was all, and it was enough. Old Walt still worked the ranch. His hip was worse in cold weather, and he had been offered a lighter arrangement 3 separate times, and had refused 3 separate times. And eventually Ryder had stopped offering because Walt found it insulting to be offered less work than he was capable of, and Ryder understood that. May still ran the eating house in Dustfall, and still made the best coffee in the county, and still noticed everything and said less than she noticed. Her son Daniel had been dead for 3 years now, and the grief had changed shape the way grief does, from something sharp to something she carried, and on good days the carrying was simply part of her, and not a weight at all. On a Sunday morning in the second autumn after the wedding, Ryder was in the corral with a young bay horse, green broke, uncertain, the kind of animal that goes still when it does not understand rather than bolt, which is the beginning of being trainable. Sitting on the top rail of the fence, watching with the unblinking focus of someone absorbing a lesson they do not have words for yet, was their son. His name was James, 14 months old, named for Ryder's father, whose name had come up once in a conversation that Nora had not let herself forget. James was too young to ride and too young to understand what his father was doing in technical terms, but he watched the way children watch things that matter to the adults they love, with absolute, undivided, wordless attention. Ryder worked the horse in slow circles. He spoke to it in a low voice, the same tone he used with all animals, patient and unhurried. Then he looked up at his son on the fence rail and said, because the boy was watching and that was reason enough to say it out loud, "Do not fight it. You are just telling it where you want to go." Nora was standing in the barn doorway. She had come out to get a bridle and had stopped when she heard those words because she had heard them before. Not about a horse. She stood in the doorway and watched her son watch his father. And she thought about a grain sack splitting on a wet depot platform in the rain. And a man who looked at her before anything else and asked whether she was hurt. She thought about 3 weeks of learning to read a horse's weight and how to break ice from a trough and how to run a ranch's accounts in a way that told the truth. She thought about a shoulder that did not move away in the cold. She thought about a hand held out in afternoon light, ungloved, the scar visible with nothing asked and everything offered. She thought, this is what it looks like when the answer is finally no. This is what it looks like when you are not hurt anymore. James saw her in the doorway and pointed at her with the serious authority of a 14-month-old who has identified something important and wants credit for the identification. Ryder turned. He saw her. The corner of his mouth moved. He turned back to the horse. She went back inside. The Sunday morning continued the way Sunday mornings continue, steadily and without ceremony. The bay horse made 3 circles and then 4, and learned something it would remember. James watched until he decided he had seen enough and required a different kind of attention, and said so clearly. The cottonwood at the edge of the creek was going yellow again, the way it did every year, marking the turn of the season the way the land marks all its passages, without announcement and without apology. Inside the ranch house, at the desk in the back room, beside a window that looked out over a corral where a man she trusted completely was teaching her son that you do not fight the thing you are trying to lead. Nora Calloway Cole opened the day's correspondence and began to work. The land still knew her name. She had decided to deserve it. This is where the story ends. Not because everything was resolved into perfect stillness, but because 2 people who had come at each other sideways across a rain-soaked depot platform had, by the ordinary daily accumulation of chosen honesty and shared labor and the willingness to stay, built something that was entirely theirs. The Calloway fortune existed, the ranch existed, the fund existed, the child on the fence rail existed. All of it was real and all of it would last, but none of it was the point. The point was a hand held out without explanation in afternoon light, and another hand that took it. The point was the question asked first before name or consequence or purpose. Are you hurt? And the long, slow, hard-won answer. No, not anymore. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.